Hi, folks, and welcome to Otto's Notebook with Grace, Skyler, and Malcolm, a podcast intended to spark conversations about the mindedness of organisms and connect influential and contemporary ideas from philosophy to your experience. In today's episode, How to Think Like a Dog, we'll be talking about animal minds, specifically the minds of street dogs. We argue that street dogs are minded. To offer a philosophical context, we'll be citing philosophers and scholars Kristen Andrews, Kim Sterelny, and Andy Clark. We'll ask questions such as, is the street dog's mind embedded in objects around itself? How does a street dog interact with its environment? And is a street dog's mind extended into other entities?
So our thesis is as follows. Using Andrews' argument of analogy, Sterelny's assumptions on embedded cognition, and Clark's theory on extended mind, we argue that animals are minded through an example of street dogs. First, I'll explain Andrews' basic arguments around mindedness, surrounding argument from analogy, and looking at the debate surrounding animal cognition. I almost immediately turn my head towards scholar, professor, and animal mind enthusiast Kristen Andrews, whose empirical research has opened many doors regarding the conversation on animal minds. One of the many things I appreciate about Andrews is her wish to change the language surrounding the philosophy of the mind. And I think when engaging in a conversation about animal minds, we have to challenge our normal assumptions about minds, such as only humans have minds or the mind is located in the brain. In challenging these notions, we must also challenge our vocabulary. Now, how you and I use the term mind is as a noun, similar to how most people talk about minds. We say the mind, as if the mind is a specific object. However, Andrews proposes that humans and animals are minded as a verb. First of all, the makeup of my mind, all the memories, navigational techniques, symbols, hardware, and other gunk that makes up my mind, is incredibly different from Skyler's and Grace's. Thus, humans, as Andrews points out, are neurally diverse. All our minds are varied in some way. With this in mind, pun not intended, there can be no such thing as the mind, because all our minds are extraordinarily different. Second, the mind develops over time. For example, the capabilities of the stuff that I can fathom in my mind has been totally expanded since I was 7 years old. Our minds also change in response to various experiences, such as traumatic experiences. In this sense, the mind is plastic, as it changes significantly throughout its life. The facts surrounding neural diversity and plasticity make the noun form of mind inaccurate, as it is not a stable, constant thing. Andrews says it well, begin quote, "There is no one right way of being minded. And being minded is a doing, not merely a having." End quote. Now, in relating this more specifically to animal minds, let's talk about distinction between animal and human minds. The first thing that I think of is the location of the brain. Humans' brains are all located in our heads, right? Well, it's not that simple for other animals. Several species of spiders technically don't have a brain, and instead actually have multiple clusters of nerve cells that extend throughout their abdomen and into their legs. I personally consider these species and others minded because scientists have found that spiders actually have memory, relying more on their mind to locate food in a web than the actual vibrations that food, in this case flies, create on the web. In a similar fashion, octopi also do not have a central organ of neurons, but are spread throughout their body and into the ends of their tentacles. I personally consider octopi minded because in a couple studies, several different octopi figured out how to shoot water at light bulbs around the testing area, causing electric power supply to short circuit and leaving the octopi and scientists in total darkness. In addition, in the same study, one octopus just sprayed water at one of the scientists repeatedly during its time in the lab. It just simply didn't like that one scientist. This shows that the octopi have memory activation and recognition abilities, which is very impressive. Thus, what many people consider characteristics of mindedness, memory, navigation techniques, recognition, are traits of human minds. and trying to find a definition of minds and which organisms have minds and which ones don't. It's helpful if we turn back to Andrews, who looks at multiple arguments philosophers and scientists have used over the years to argue their claims of how they define the mind in humans and our subject today, animals. Referencing back to my earlier comment, argument from analogy surrounds the idea that if the minds in animals are similar to human minds, then those animals have minds. Specifically, and I'm looking at page 19 in the Andrews text here, begin quote, number 1, all humans have minds, have some property M. Number 2, individuals of species A have property M. Number 3, therefore individuals of species A probably have minds, end quote. The property M, as Andrew mentions, can be stuff like, begin quote, general capacities such as cognitive flexibility, a special ability such as using language, a biological process such as sexual reproduction, end quote. Well, this argument is nice because of its simplicity, but as Andrew points out, this can be dangerous because animals can be so different from humans. It's difficult to find objective similarities between us and, say, cephalopods or arachnids. So finding that property M, the similarity, is hard. I mean, how am I similar to a bee? But bees have been shown to dream and communicate through a dance language, so I would consider them minded. However, today we'll be using this analogy argument to say that dogs are minded because their cognitive abilities are similar to humans in multiple ways, as we'll discuss later. But for now, let's move on to Sterelny's thoughts on the embedded mind.
Contemporary philosophers of cognitive science are engaged with the project of defining what minds are and what they are not. Currently, the most popular school of thought is 4E cognition. The two of the 4 E's that we are concerned with today are the theories of the extended mind, developed by Andy Clark, and the embedded mind, developed by Kim Sterelny. We'll talk you through these two arguments and then see how these qualities of mindedness might be observed in street dogs. Kim Sterelny is an Australian philosopher of science. To start our investigation of 4E cognition, we're first going to be considering his view on the embedded picture of cognition. The embedded mind hypothesis proposes that human cognitive capacities both depend on and have been transformed by environmental resources. Often, these resources have been preserved, built, or modified precisely because they enhance cognitive capacity. Sterelny argues that agents engage in a reciprocal process of adapting to the environment and adapting the environment to them. He thinks that this adaptive plasticity results in a sort of creation of shortcuts so that whatever information in the environment is relevant is made maximally salient and easy to decipher. Sterelny suggests that the ways in which our cognitive processes are embedded into the environment vary on 3 dimensions. These 3 dimensions are all connected to how information is transformed into this more salient form and is thus more accessible to the agent. The first of these dimensions is trust. Sterelny thinks that a well-adaptive agent uses both reliable and unreliable sources, and that we can determine whether our resources are reliable or not by reflecting on whether there exist barriers to a particular resource which makes them inaccessible in cases where it is needed, or whether the resource is ours alone, or whether it may be subject to change by other agents. The next dimension of the functional relationship between environment and agents is the degree to which the environment has been personalized. Sterelny calls these qualities of interchangeability, individualization, and entrenchment, and all of our environmental resources are somewhere on the spectrum. There are many tools that are interchangeable. For example, we're generally able to drive any car from one place to the next. However, you might have some trouble parallel parking if you've borrowed a friend's van while the Miata's in the shop. The degree to which these tools are individualized depends on how the tools are adjusted for your needs. So if you're missing an eye, you might have an extra large mirror on that side of your car, which eliminates the blind spot. Or for driving aficionados, you might have a shorter gear stick to shift gears more quickly. Any modifications made are in the name of ends. In those cases, it would be avoiding collisions or best getting control over your car during burnouts or street racing. Finally, there's the case of entrenchment, where the physical characteristics of the environment are not only individualized, but the way the agent interacts with the environment is also attuned to the properties of the individualized object. We might think of Formula One drivers whose seat, steering wheel, and everything else in the car is maximally attuned for control and speed. The car becomes entrenched with the body and feels like an extension of their feet and hands, and interactions between the body and the world are felt at the edges of the car rather than at the hands and feet of the driver. Reflect on the experience of cringing as your teenager backs the family car into an obstacle for the first time. Would it be wrong to say that you actually felt the crunching bumper? Finally, Sterelny makes a distinction between individual and collective, focusing on the contributions of social interactions and the problem-solving capacities that emerge from particular groups. Collective resources are those that are shaped and shape the agents within the name of a collective end. We might take a research lab as one of these collaborative social resources. The lab tech, PI, grad student, and undergrad are all required in order to get the research done.
That's very interesting, Grace. And now we'll be moving on to Clark's argument for the extended mind.
When thinking about animal minds, especially general cognition, one perspective to note is from Andy Clark, a British philosopher and cognitive scientist who believes that the mind extends beyond the brain. For Clark, the mind extends into the world through the use of devices, helping humans articulate our thinking beyond just what's happening in our brain. In this view of the mind, environmental factors have particular importance and presence in explaining how cognition operates as a complementary tool for cognitive processes. In an extended mind perspective, the cognitive processes happening within a cognitive agent are being dispersed onto its environment as a way to alleviate the flow of information away from just within the brain and body. Clark elaborates further with the introduction of the parity principle, which he states, and I quote, "If, as we confront some task as a part of the world, functions as a process which were it to go on in the head, we would have no hesitation in accepting as a part of the cognitive process, then that part of the world is part of the cognitive process," end quote. Given the interaction of humans to the world, humans do this kind of sort of task, and their interaction with the world contributes to that overall cognitive processing of information. Clark suggests that since the world has a part in this process happening in the head, then the world and one's environment is a part of this process. One particular popular example, I should say, that Clark uses is Igna's memory and Otto's notebook to remember the location of a particular place via two different mediums. Here, Otto's notebook is the tool that extends the mind as it distributes the cognitive processes away from just the brain and inserts it into the environment with the notebook and the notes taking on it about a certain location and certain things to watch out for. But according to Clark, what really qualifies a tool that extends the mind? Clark really talks about and describes 4 criteria that define a tool extending the mind. First criterion is that the resource is reliably available and typically invoked, such that the resource consults the attaining of knowledge. Second, the resource is automatically endorsed and is trustworthy, similar to that of memory. Third, the resource's information is also easily accessible when required. And lastly, it is consciously endorsed from past exposure and comes from a result of this experience. These 4 criteria make up the structure of Clark's extended mind and lays a foundation for identifying an extended mind tool.
Thank you, Skyler. So far, we've talked about the argument from analogy, embedded cognition, and the extension of the mind into objects and the environment. We'll be getting into the juicier stuff now, about how street dogs are in fact minded, using frameworks from Sterelny and Clark, of course. We'll catch you right after the break. Stay tuned.